74 rotate.
Look off your script.
Ground effect, positive rate.
A Beechcraft Bonanza A36 single engine was flown by a private pilot, instrument-rated anesthesiologist with 2,260 hours. The Bonanza crashed into an open field 35 minutes after departing on an IFR trip from Duluth, Minnesota to Kansas City, Missouri. That trip should have taken more than 3 hours. The pilot recorded having trouble controlling the aircraft while climbing through 10,000 feet to a flight plan altitude of 12,000 feet. The pilot then fell unconscious, entering a diving spiral, and hit the ground 21 seconds later. Both the pilot and wife were killed. Eric Drucker was a by-the-numbers pilot. At 56 years of age, he had been flying for almost 30 years, the last 10 of which were in his pride of joy, a Beechcraft A36 Bonanza, purchased with low time in mint condition and kept that way. From the time that Eric and the Bonanza came together, neither had been spared any expense in striving for complete perfection. The Bonanza had every toy that could be packed safely into an airplane, redundancy of every possible system, and a host of creature comfort accessories. Eric was meticulous about maintaining his IFR proficiency, with a continuous regiment of recurrent training and ground school classes and videos. He also qualified for the Wings program for 8 running years, and read most of the leading aviation periodicals regularly. He was especially into accident reports, and often became quite vocal about those pilots who gave aviation a black. It was late October, a 9 degrees Celsius cloudy Saturday morning in Kansas City, pretty typical for West Central Missouri. Eric and Frida, his wife of 39 years, arrived at the airport 2.5 hours before takeoff, giving themselves plenty of time for breakfast with the airport gang, preceded by a short call to flight service for a lay of the land report, as Eric always liked. After breakfast, a lengthy conversation with flight service ended with an IFR flight plan for a 10:35 a.m. departure. 9,000 feet initial altitude with 11,000 feet requested when available. 3 hours, 5 minutes time en route to Duluth, Minnesota for his nephew's wedding the next day. Most of the flight would be between layers, with only a slight chance of some light icing in the clouds at 6,000 to 7,000 feet. All in all, a nice tail end and a smooth, uneventful ride. Eric was relaxed as he loaded the luggage and checked every inch and orifice of his Beechcraft beauty with a sense. The flight to Duluth was exactly as had been predicted. On time, a trace of ice climbing through 6,500 feet, smooth as silk at 9,000 feet between cloud layers, and his wife's almost by herself landing was on the money. During the 2 hours and 30 minutes at 9,000 feet, Eric and Frida used their oxygen masks periodically, as was Eric's usual practice anytime he was above 7,000 feet. After they landed, Eric signed in at the FBO service counter and ordered full tanks, oil to just below the full mark, and then nearly empty oxygen bottles to be refilled.
I guess you could call my dad a Type A pilot. He did everything in flying with the same intensity as he did in his anesthesiology practice. He checked, double-checked, and triple-checked every detail. As a result, he was the best, most careful pilot I ever flew with. I'm an instrument pilot myself, but I've never been as dedicated as my dad was. I used to tell him he was a classic nitpicker, but it never fazed him. He'd just spout off on some story about an accident he'd read about, and then usually give me a parting shot with his favorite flying saying, "Stay with it or stay out of the sky." He was always saving my life. Dad was absolutely certain that my mother could get the airplane to an airport and land safely if anything happened to him. She never believed it, but I think she could have. The few times I flew backseat with them and watched Dad force her to shoot a landing with plenty of adjustments and backup from him, she did okay. Not exactly an eventful or greaser of a landing, but never to the point of breaking up the airplane. The one time she did really well, she seemed to feel pretty pleased with herself about it. Dad insisted he hadn't helped very much, and she didn't argue with him. But I remember her telling him that he'd better stay healthy or my sister and I would be early inheritors. I think he could have handled it. Dad used the oxygen routinely. After all, he was an anesthesiologist, so he understood all there was to know about hypoxia. In fact, he was kind of a crusader about oxygen in airplanes. He wrote lots of letters to the flying magazines and the FAA. Some of his stuff got printed, and he got some nice thank yous from the government once in a while, but nothing much ever came of it. He even got his local FBO to always have oxygen available, but he may have been their only regular customer for it. He even got a couple of his flying buddies put masks and bottles on their airplanes and taught them how to use it, but I'm not sure if they
Eric and Frida spent a hectic weekend in Duluth, attending parties, visiting with Eric's brother, Walter, and his wife and family. Finally, enjoying a lovely wedding thrown by one of Duluth's most prominent families. Food and especially drink were plentiful and continuous. Meet Walter Drucker, Eric's 58-year-old brother.
We had one hell of a weekend, maybe the best we had ever had as a family. Even Eric, he usually acted like a teetotaler because of his damned flying. He and Frida just got caught up really in the partying and really loosened up. It was great to see them have such a good time. But right after we left church, Eric went back into his non-drinking mode. I doubt if he had more than one small glass of wine, and maybe a sip or two of champagne during the whole reception. After the reception was over, most of our family came back to our place for a farewell cordial. You know, one for the road. Anyway, Eric was a good sport about it, but then he bawled me out for...
At 8 a.m. on Monday morning, Walter Drucker and his wife met Eric and Frida at their motel for breakfast. Right after they ordered, Eric excused himself to call a flight service. The briefing was complete, straightforward, and with only one surprise. The winds aloft were more favorable at 12,000 feet than at 9,000 feet. At 8 a.m. on Monday morning, Walter Drucker and his wife met Eric and Frida at their motel for breakfast. Right after they ordered, Eric excused himself to call flight service. The briefing was complete, straightforward, and with only one surprise. The winds aloft were more favorable at 12,000 feet than at 9,000 feet. According to the briefing, local ceilings holding at 1,500 to 2,000 feet, solid through 10,500 this area. Several PIREPs over in Minneapolis have tops at just under 11,000. Ceilings lowered en route to 800 feet and 4 miles visibility in the Kansas City area. Expect some rain and possibly a few wildly scattered thunderstorms through most of the northern Missouri. Conditions improving after 1800 Zulu, which is 1 p.m. Central Time at Greenwich. Winds aloft at 9,000 feet were 240 at 40 knots, 12,000 feet were 260 at 40 knots, and 18,000 feet were 270 at 55 knots. At the time of departure, freezing level will be between 7,000 and 9,000 feet, though no icing has been reported by any departing aircraft. Eric did his usual quick time en route calculations and filed his flight plan. Departure at 10:30 a.m. local time in Duluth, flying at 12,000 feet. Time en route is 3 hours and 35 minutes, with 5.5 hours of fuel on board. He also told the briefer he would pick up clearance airborne rather than call in for a release time. He figured that flight service might be hard to reach by phone at that hour. He also did not like rushing his run-up or takeoff to stay within short release times. Besides, the local ceiling and visibility were forecast to be comfortable VFR.
In retrospect, I wish he had never had. That one lousy drink must have been what caused his residual blood alcohol to show up 1/10 of a point over the limit. None of us believe that such a tiny overage by itself could have caused the accident. We think the oxygen problem was a primary cause, or at least a major contributor. But we couldn't prove that. So, we wound up accepting a terrible settlement from the insurance company that cost his kids a fortune. Anyway, Eric ordered his breakfast and then let us go to file his flight plan. When he came back to the table, almost 20 minutes later, his breakfast was already cold. He didn't seem to care, though, because he was mostly interested in telling Frida and us about how their flight was going to be. I think he called it Easy IFR or something to that effect. About 2 bites into his breakfast, he said that he was feeling a little punk and he was going to call back and move their takeoff time back an hour or so. After he finished breakfast, I guess Frida was kind of anxious to get home because she suggested he wait until 10:15 to make that decision. I'm sure he would have started feeling better after another couple hours. I had blocked out the whole morning, so it didn't matter much to me. It was a little more time with my brother, who I only saw a couple times a year. It was nice. We talked about a lot of things just because we had nothing else to do.
Well, here's your bill. Everything was paid for.
Thank you.
I have a headache, and those 3 bits of cold omelet I had for breakfast don't seem to be sitting too well. I'm not feeling hungover, just a bit frazzled from the weekend. Not having enough time to relax. Flight service took forever to get a hold of.
Any issues?
Well, the Howard's East-West military operating areas are both active from 2:30 for the rest of the afternoon. And with the delayed departure, they could be a problem. So I'd decided to file for an 11:30 departure. We should be past the southernmost border of the MOA, 15 minutes to spare.
So it looks good, 38 gallons of 100 low lead, 2 quarts of oil for 86.60. That's about right.
It was kind of an unusual request for us, especially on a Saturday. We mostly sell oxygen to corporate pilots, and yours is just a private one. At least for most people based out of here. But even at that, we don't sell very much of oxygen, so we're a flat country out here. The line boy either overlooked it or expected the Sunday crew to take care of it when they checked the oil. How it got past our counter girl, I can't say. Maybe because it was so busy, but whatever. It couldn't have made a huge difference in what happened, especially since the accident didn't really get above 10,000 feet, so they wouldn't have needed the oxygen.
Eric rejoined his party, took his credit card and folded service receipt from Frida, never looking at it though, and sat down for the rest of the hour they had to kill. 40 minutes later, Eric was feeling better. He decided to load the plane a little early and take some extra time doing his pre-flight. He was glad he did. He found the oil in the dipstick above the full line by nearly half a quart, enough to cause the engine to throw oil in flight. A hasty, annoyed, but subdued visit to the service center brought an even hastier response from the embarrassed mechanic. In fewer than 10 minutes, the situation was being corrected by a mechanic who also brought along a portable air tank because he thought that Bonanza's nose wheel looked a bit puffy, but very likely to further appease what he thought was a justifiably angry customer. Eric rechecked the loading of the baggage while the oil was being drained, and continued a much-interrupted pre-flight. The mechanic was a friendly talker, and after at least 3 starts and stops, the pre-flight was completed. Unfortunately, the oxygen bottle had never been checked. This was a fatal overlook by the pilot.
74 rotate,
Look up your script.
ground effect, positive rate. Dulles Center, this is Bonanza 24 Bravo. Dulles Center, this is Bonanza 24 Bravo. Dulles Center, this is Bonanza 24 Bravo.
Bonanza 24 Bravo, this is Dulles Center. Go ahead.
Dulles Center, Bonanza 24 Bravo, confirming IFR flight plan, off time, 11:32, climbing through 1,000 feet.
Bonanza 24 Bravo, Dulles Center. Expect moderate turbulence in the clouds. Light rime icing reported by several aircraft between 7,000 and 9,000 feet. Tops at 10,800. Your vicinity. Please report your base upon entering the clouds. You are cleared to 10,000. Expect further clearance to 12,000 in about 20 minutes.
Bonanza 24, check that, clear to 10,000 feet. Further clearance, 12,000 feet in 20 minutes. Tighten your shoulder harness. It's going to be bumpy.
One step ahead of you. Mine's already tight.
Dulles Center, Bonanza 24 Bravo, just passing through 1,700 feet, reporting light turbulence. Clouds based at 1,800 feet, now entering full IMC.
After 3 big shakes of turbulence, Eric was dead set on his HSI. Keeping his airplane under control was his first priority. He then noticed the heading indicator had drifted 15 degrees to the right. Eric began a correcting left turn just as another sudden jolt of turbulence hit the Bonanza, throwing the HSI up and to the left. Eric reacted with down pressure to the right on the yoke, which caused an overreaction just in time for the next jolt, followed by several more. Eric found himself fighting the turbulence, not noticing his altimeter racing up, his airspeed quickly deteriorating, and the directional gyro now 25 degrees left of his intended heading, the number 1 ADI needle in a full right deflection. To make matters worse, he suddenly felt a spinning sensation and a heaviness in the pit of his stomach. Recognizing the onset of vertigo, Eric reflexively loosened his grip on the yoke, covered one eye, as he had demonstrated to dozens of pilots in the lectures he had given, and took 2 deep breaths. The Bonanza began to slowly level itself off, despite the continuing but now lighter turbulence. Eric's sensation of spinning eased also. His nausea had abated. Center had been tracking the Bonanza's errant flight, along with those of several other aircraft. It was an unusual blustery October day, and by the time they reached him, Eric was sure he and his airplane were
A-OK and climbing through 5,000. Turning back on course now. That turbulence was a lot worse than moderate.
Center acknowledged, cleared him back on course, and turned their attention to other aircraft. Frida, who was badly shaken by their wild ride, also took a couple of deep breaths to compose herself. She had noticed Eric struggling in a cold sweat and obviously unable to control the aircraft. With the turbulence subsided, she began to attending to Eric, dabbing his forehead with a soft handkerchief and trying to settle him down. It worked. Now feeling better, but still quite upset over his bout with vertigo, Eric began preparing for the next encounter. This time, rhinium icing reported between 7,000 and 9,000 feet. As they passed through 5,500 feet, he reached around back for his oxygen mask, put it on, and opened the valve on the bottle a half a turn, by feel as he had done it dozens of times. Frida knew the routine well and casually took her own mask from the pocket in the back of her seat and put it on also. Neither of them noticed that, after only a few breaths, very little oxygen was coming into their masks. The bottle was almost empty, and they were concentrating on other things, Eric on icing, and Frida on Eric. Duelist Senator Bonanza 2-4 Bravo, we had a report of moderate to severe chop at 10,000 feet from a descending 727, 25 miles south of you, about 10 miles east of your current flight path. You can stay at 8,000 for now until we clear you at 12,000. Tops are still reporting at just under 11,000 feet.
We're starting to pick up some ice here at 8,000, so I think we'll continue climbing. We'd appreciate you expediting that clearance to 12,000, and I'll let you know if we run into that turbulence.
Center acknowledged, but was now monitoring the flight more carefully. The aircraft was 13 minutes behind its flight plan. Some fast calculations by the controller caused serious enough concern for her to call her supervisor. There was now a strong possibility that the Bonanza would not be clear of the Howard MOA ahead by 2:30 and would have to be diverted. Any further erosion of the flight plan, plus a diversion, could leave the aircraft with inadequate IFR fuel reserves, and conditions in Kansas City were not improving as it had been expected. Fortunately, they were not getting worse. The supervisor rechecked the calculations and glanced at the controller screen, just in time to see the target once again drifting off course, then suddenly climbing and going through 10,000 feet without clearance. Bonanza 2-4 Bravo, you're 20 degrees right of course and above your assigned altitude. Please advise. Bonanza 2-4 Bravo, you're 20 degrees right of course and above your assigned altitude. Please advise. The aircraft had leveled off at 10,600 feet and was starting to descend, slowly. It was also turning left and passing through its on-course heading. Then it reversed course and began climbing again.
I'm having a control problem. Heavy turbulence. Need that clearance to 12,000 now.
You're clear to 12,000. Say your condition. In the cockpit, Eric was having more than a control problem. He and Frida were breathing stale air from the now empty oxygen bottle, and his head was starting to spin again. The vertigo was coming back this time, like a tidal wave. He tried to reply to center, but was being overwhelmed by the severe dizziness. Realizing that he was in trouble and something was wrong with his breathing, Eric flailed at his mask. He was too late. With his hand gripping the mask, Eric passed out and fell forward against the yoke. The airplane lurched into a diving spiral. Frida never had a chance. It happened too quickly. In her own weakened condition, and with a sudden lurch of the airplane, she tried to reach to Eric, but passed out on top of him. That was a blessing. Center watched helplessly as the target disappeared from its scopes, and 21 seconds later, the aircraft crashed into an open field. Neither occupant survived.
The accident investigators said that both Dad and Mother apparently had their masks on before they went down. They also said they had determined that there was no oxygen on board. The FBO in Duluth never filled the bottle, even though it was marked on Dad's fuel order. But they didn't consider oxygen to be a factor in the accident because the highest they got was about 10.5, and they were only there for a few minutes at most. But I and every doctor I've talked to agrees that the stale, thinner air that Dad and Mother were breathing, because the damn bottle went empty, definitely could have aggravated the effects of residual blood alcohol. What I can't figure out is how the oxygen screw-up got past everyone. What with Dad being such a fanatic about it? I know that my mother signed the fuel order, and that there was some kind of a problem during the pre-flight. All of that came out in the investigation in Duluth, but I just can't imagine Dad not checking his bottle, especially since he had filed for 12,000 feet. Another thing I can't understand is how Dad could have had any residual blood alcohol in his body from the little bit of wine and champagne he had at the wedding. I know that he had one small after-dinner drink later with my uncle, Walter, but that was at least 13 hours before they took off. I know it sounds like sour grapes because we had to make very unfair settlement with the insurance company, but the FAA and NTSB and all of the so-called experts will never convince me or any members of our family or anyone who knew Dad and the way he was about flying that alcohol was the sole cause of the accident. It had to be because the stale air and the lack of oxygen intensified the problem. I'm sorry to sound like such a jerk about it, but that FBO should have been held responsible, and the FAA or someone should come up with a better set of rules or guidelines for blowing what your blood alcohol level is when you climb into an airplane. Dad waited over 13 hours. That sure as hell should have been long enough.
The Drucker family was understandably upset with the NTSB findings, but the NTSB considers those findings to be clear-cut. The autopsy confirmed that the pilot's blood alcohol level was .05 or .01 over the FAA limit, 25% too high.
The finding was absolute, and it was reconfirmed by the pathologists who were hired by the pilot's brother, who was a lawyer. He acted on behalf of the Drucker family, very intensely, I might add. Their claim that the lack of oxygen, the problem with the mask contributed to the accident, is entirely possible, but there's no way to prove it, especially considering the very short time they were at altitude. What many pilots don't seem to grasp is the fact that a .04 alcohol level is still plenty of alcohol. We have a file of cabinet full of reports of encounters where there was only half that much blood alcohol. One of NASA's space medicine specialists had a theory about this case. Based on the transcript, she thought that there was probably a short partial boot with vertigo, or at least some spatial disorientation when the aircraft first entered the clouds. The transmissions and the tapes of the center radar seemed to verify that. Then, after recovering from the vertigo and climbing on course, the pilot would have started using oxygen at 7,500 or 8,000 feet. Based upon his reported usual procedures, after that, it was just terribly bad luck. He probably hit the higher altitude turbulence just as he, being an anesthesiologist, realized that he wasn't getting any oxygen. He may have panicked, or at the very least was distracted by it. Then he went into full-blown vertigo. According to NTSB reports, there are a few things we do know about vertigo. Firstly, we do not know of a single case of a pilot surviving after 2 encounters with severe vertigo in the same flight, and our ground tests confirm positively that the second shot of it is almost much worse than the first, and completely debilitating vertigo is just not something for pilots to be messing with. But he did exactly the wrong thing. He continued the flight after experiencing vertigo because judgment was impaired by the alcohol. Judgment is always the first thing to go in cases of alcohol impairment, and hypoxia too.
Robert L. Cohn, the author of They Called It Pilot Error, says the following. NASA soon afterward expanded its studies of the effect of oxygen and the lack of oxygen on residual blood alcohol impairment, especially as it relates to a three-dimensional orientation. Neither the NTSB or the FAA has undertaken any new action relating to the subject. They'll undoubtedly require confirming direction from medical and scientific sources before doing so.
There were several communication errors that occurred throughout the flight. Most had the snowball effect that started as no big deal but led to a chain of unfortunate events that might have directly caused the accident. As mentioned by the FBO mechanic, the amount of assumptions and plain ignorance that occurred relating to the oxygen tank being refilled was out of control. The line boy might have missed it or assumed that the Sunday crew would handle it when they confirmed full tanks and appropriate amounts of oil. The Sunday crew missed it, however, and so did the manager and the wife while handling the bill. I wouldn't quite immediately blame the pilot for not checking the bill, as he did delegate a responsible person, but Frida did miss it along with the entire FBO crew handling the plane. However, upon realizing that the oil was overfilled, the pilot should have double-checked the oxygen tank immediately since he was already annoyed by the apparent incompetence at the FBO. Another crucial communication error was when the mechanic was continuously interrupting the pilot during his walk-around, a vital part of every flight to ensure airworthiness. These interruptions, which the pilot should have ignored, led him to overlook the oxygen tank. Poor pilot decision-making was, of course, another critical error, as the pilot was not feeling well before the flight, so no matter how much he had to drink, he still missed the first step in the I'm safe checklist, illness. Pilot decision-making is also to blame for him not choosing to turn around or divert to a new airport after the first bout of vertigo, as well for him to climb into known severe turbulence reported by the 727. Severe turbulence being defined as strong enough that the aircraft may no longer be controlled by the pilot. He should have turned around at many points during this flight.
What can I take away from this crash investigation? Eric makes good personal choices his entire life. Choosing to use oxygen past 7,000 feet, which is well below the legal limit, shows us just how safe of a pilot he was. And no matter how safe he was on average, one day of being lax on a walk around, or choosing to just push ahead with a flight despite feeling ill, deciding to continue through heavy turbulence and vertigo instead of going back, that one day caused his death. This to me is a story of caution, showing that you should never be lax with yourself, and that when it feels hardest to be safe is when you should push yourself to the highest standards of safety. Secondly, the story showed me in a very real way just how easy it is to succumb to hypoxia. We have a doctor specializing in anesthesiology who refuses to go above 7,000 feet without using oxygen periodically. That really shows sometimes you need to hold yourself to a higher standard of safety than the law has been set.